The house stood at the edge of the dirt road, where the forest began to swallow the town. Smoke curled from its chimney, heavy and sweet, like roasted meat. No one questioned what the widow served her boarders, not until a farmhand found bones that did not belong to any animal. Caledonia Ridge, Missouri, 1856. A place too small for maps, yet large enough to keep its secrets. The river curled around it like a dirty ribbon, and when the fog rose from the banks each dawn, the whole town seemed to vanish into its own breath. Wagon wheels creaked across rutted clay, lanterns guttered in windows where no laughter lived. It was the kind of settlement that smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and rain-soaked wheat, a town stitched together by hunger and rumor. At the highest bend of the ridge stood a narrow house, timber darkened by weather and time. Ivy climbed its bones. The porch sagged like a tired sigh, and yet the sign above the door still promised boarding and meals, fair rates. Inside lived Eleanor Wren, a woman whose silence carried more weight than most sermons. She wore black not from fashion but conviction. Her husband, Thomas Wren, had perished 7 winters earlier when a hunting accident left him scattered, as the preacher delicately phrased it. Since then, she had cooked for travelers, drovers, traders, the occasional preacher drifting west, and they all said the same thing. The widow's stew could raise a man from the edge of exhaustion. Eleanor's kitchen was her chapel. Each morning she rose before the rooster's first cough, ground herbs by lamplight, and fed the hearth as if tending a heartbeat. The smell drifted down the ridge, thick, sweet, strangely metallic, and even the dogs lingered near her fence. No one asked where she found her meat. Deer had grown scarce, and the butcher's cart seldom reached that far. Still, her larder never emptied. The townsfolk pitied her loneliness, but feared her calm. She never attended church, claiming the Lord already dined in her house. When asked what she meant, she only smiled, a slow, patient curve of the lips that made men remember unfinished prayers. On a rain-drunk evening in May, a merchant from St. Louis arrived, soaked to the bone and desperate for shelter. The widow greeted him with polite distance and a pot already simmering on the stove. Steam fogged the windows, the air hummed with quiet domestic peace. He ate 2 bowls, complimented the tenderness of the meat, and wiped his mouth with gratitude. Eleanor watched him closely, the lamplight catching in her eyes like tiny coals. By the time the merchant's plate was empty, his fate had already been decided. The widow's house stood apart from Caledonia Ridge, a mile of gravel road and quiet fields separating her from the rest of the town. By daylight it looked almost peaceful, white curtains stirring behind clean glass, herbs hanging to dry, a rocking chair on the porch that moved with the wind. But at night, it became something else entirely, a silhouette against the moon, still and watchful, as though it listened. Eleanor Wren kept her home in perfect order. Each shelf gleamed, each floorboard creaked only when she allowed it. There was one door, however, that never opened, the small padlocked entrance leading down to the cellar. When visitors asked where it went, she told them the steps had rotted years ago, and it wasn't safe. Her voice made the lie sound like truth. Behind the house stretched a modest patch of earth, not quite a garden, not quite a graveyard. Its soil was darker than the rest of the ridge, rich and heavy, as if it remembered rain no one else had seen. Locals noticed she never kept livestock, though her smokehouse was always full. Some guessed she hunted alone, others whispered she traded meat for silence. Only one man dared speak his suspicion aloud. Old Mr. Tate, the blacksmith's uncle, who lived in a shack down by the river. He swore the widow was cursed, that he'd seen her dragging something through the fields one night, something shaped like a man but limp as a harvest sack. The townsmen laughed him off. They said Tate drank too much whiskey and saw ghosts where there were none. But Tate's laughter ended the night his nephew disappeared. The boy had been delivering nails to the widow's house before the storm came. He was supposed to return before sundown. When morning broke, the trail to her porch was washed clean. No prints, no cart marks, nothing but the smell of ash on wet air. 2 days later, a hunter found the boy's boots beside the widow's back gate, soles up, neatly placed, as though waiting for feet that would never fill them again. The sheriff asked Eleanor about it. She said the rain must have carried them. There, her tone was kind, her hands steady, her eyes unreadable. Outside, the wind picked up, and from beneath the porch came a sound no one wanted to name. At dawn, only the boy's boots were found, beside the widow's back gate. Sheriff Samuel Dyer had seen his share of disappearances along the Missouri. Trails, drifters swallowed by river currents, travelers lost to fever, or thieves gone missing after midnight quarrels. But this was different. There was no pattern in the wilderness, until he drew a circle on his map and saw that every vanished soul had last been sighted within a 10-mile ring around Eleanor Wren's boarding house. He rode up the ridge under a sky the color of lead. The air felt heavy, and the closer he came, the quieter the woods grew, as if the trees themselves held their breath. Eleanor greeted him on the porch, her dress spotless, her hair pinned tight. She offered him coffee, then a bowl of stew that steamed in the chill morning air. The aroma was rich, almost intoxicating, garlic, sage, and something faintly sweet beneath. Dyer asked about the missing boy, about the merchant from St. Louis, and the 2 other travelers whose names appeared on his list. She listened without flinching, stirring the stew as though the conversation bored her. "People come and go, Sheriff," she said softly. "The road takes what it wants." Her eyes lifted to his, calm, unreadable, almost tender. He left her house uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. The taste of the stew lingered in his mouth like a secret. As he mounted his horse, something pale caught his eye, a glimmer in the trough by her smokehouse. He dismounted, lantern in hand, and stepped closer. The water was murky, flecked with fat and ash. Something floated just beneath the surface. He reached in with a stick, stirred gently, and the object turned, a thin crescent of flesh, small and curved. At first he thought it a bone shard from a deer, but then his stomach tightened. It was too smooth, too perfect, a fingernail, half-moon white, still attached to a scrap of skin. He dropped the stick, heart pounding. When he turned toward the house, Eleanor stood in the doorway watching him. The lamplight behind her framed her like a portrait, motionless, unblinking. She smiled faintly, as though he'd just discovered a private joke. The sheriff nodded once, forced a polite farewell, and rode off without looking back. The sound of her door closing behind him echoed long after he'd gone. The light caught what looked like a fingernail, lodged in the drain. The first 2. Noticed the smell was Jonas Heddle, a carpenter hired to mend the widow's parlor floor. He arrived one humid afternoon, hammer slung over his shoulder, sweat already darkening his collar. Eleanor met him at the door with her usual composure, polite, distant, eyes sharp as sewing needles. "Be careful under there," she said. "The boards are old." Jonas knelt to his work, prying up warped planks near the hearth. At first, he thought the stench rising from below was from stagnant water, the kind that gathers in forgotten basements. But then it deepened, thickened, until his throat burned. It wasn't rot exactly, but something heavier. Something wrong. He coughed, covered his nose, and joked through the haze. "Ma'am, you might have rats nesting under here." Eleanor didn't laugh. She knelt beside him, peered into the gap, and said quietly, "I'll handle it." Her tone was final. Jonas noticed her hand tremble just slightly as she pressed the plank back into place. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out 2 silver coins, far more than his day's wage. "Take the rest of the day off," she said. He left without protest, grateful for the coin and the fresh air. But that night, unease settled over him. The smell clung to his clothes. When he undressed, he swore it seeped from his skin, a sweet, metallic scent that no amount of soap could erase. He told his wife he wouldn't go back up the ridge. She agreed. Women in town had long stopped visiting the widow's house, saying it gave them nightmares. Later that week, neighbors saw Eleanor dragging 2 burlap sacks toward the woods. It was near midnight, her lantern swinging low, the bags leaving trails in the damp earth. They assumed she was burying spoiled food or animal remains, waste from her kitchen. No one dared ask. By morning, a pack of stray dogs had gathered near the creek, fighting over something half buried in the mud. When one dog ran off with a pale object dangling from its mouth, a farmer chased it down, thinking it a rabbit. It wasn't. What he found instead made his stomach twist. A human finger, gnawed to the bone, with a gold ring still on it. When one dog tore free a human finger, the town's silence began to splinter. Sheriff Amos Darnell had left the ridge 5 years earlier after a winter storm took his wife and son. He'd sold his badge, sold his house, and left what little remained of his heart in a whiskey bottle down in Richmond. But when word reached him that something unholy was stirring on Widow Ashford's land, he came back. Not as law, but as reckoning. The town didn't welcome him. They watched him ride in through the fog with that same weathered Stetson pulled low and the same Colt resting easy at his side. But his eyes were different now, colder, like he'd already seen hell and wasn't afraid to go back. He didn't stop in town. He went straight up the ridge. The air thickened the higher he climbed. That same sour smell, that same unnatural quiet. Even the cicadas had gone mute. The house stood waiting. Windows dark, door cracked just enough to whisper, "Come in." He stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the flies. Hundreds of them, buzzing lazily in the parlor light, gathered around the baseboards and under the furniture. Then came the sound. Faint, like the slow drip of water beneath the floor. He knelt, pressed a hand to the boards, and felt warmth. He pried one plank loose with his knife. What came up was not soil. It was cloth, stained and damp. The edge of a sleeve, a child's sleeve. "Sweet Lord," he muttered. The sound of footsteps came from upstairs, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy for a woman alone. Amos stood, hand on his gun, eyes fixed on the staircase. "Eleanor," he called, voice rough from disuse. "You got something you want to tell me?" No answer. Only the creak of the second step, then the third. He moved toward the stairs, each step echoing like a hammer on his ribs. The figure that appeared at the top landing wasn't Eleanor. At least not anymore. Her eyes were glazed, her hands smeared with something dark that wasn't all her own. "They wouldn't stay quiet," she whispered. "They kept calling." From the floor. For a long moment, Amos said nothing. The revolver hung useless at his side. "How many?" he finally asked. Eleanor's lips quivered into a thin, joyless smile. "All of them." Then, somewhere beneath their feet, something knocked 3 times from inside the floorboards. The house had learned to answer when spoken to. The knocking didn't stop. 3 sharp, deliberate raps, like a coded signal from beneath the floor. Then silence. Then again. Each strike echoed up through the beams, hollow and wet, as if the house itself had lungs. Sheriff Amos froze, eyes locked on the floorboards. Eleanor Ashford didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head toward the sound, a faint tremor passing through her lips. "They're still hungry," she whispered. The air turned heavy, thick as syrup. A smell of iron and spoiled milk seeped from the cracks. Amos drew his gun, but he didn't point it at her. Not yet. "Show me," he said. Eleanor turned toward the kitchen, her bare feet leaving faint prints on the dusty floor. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. Pots hung from blackened hooks. A single lantern swayed on a rusted chain, its glow barely cutting through the gloom. At the far end of the room stood a wooden hatch in the floor, bolted shut from the outside. Fresh nails glistened. The knocking came from there. Amos's stomach twisted. "Who's down there?" Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Used to be boarders. Now they don't want to leave." He crouched, hand brushing the hatch. The wood was slick, not with water, but something thicker. He pushed his weight against the lock until it snapped open. A wave of stench rolled out, so vile it clawed up his throat. Inside was a crawl space, no more than 4 feet high, lined with rough stone and shreds of old bedding. Shadows moved. In the corners, he aimed the lantern. There were bones, piles of them, tiny and large, polished by time and touch. and in the farthest corner, something else, something not quite dead. A hand reached out, thin as kindling, trembling. Its fingers were gnawed to the bone. A sound rose from the pit, not speech, not even pain, just a wet, gurgling noise like someone trying to remember how to breathe. Eleanor stepped beside him, her voice suddenly calm. "They never wanted to die," she said. "They just wanted to stay." Amos staggered back, his revolver slipping from his hand. "Good God, woman. What have you done?" Eleanor smiled, faintly. "God stopped coming here long ago." Then, as if on cue, the knocking began again, not from below, but from inside the walls. The rhythm spread, traveling up the beams across the ceiling, until it seemed the entire house was alive with unseen fists pounding to be let out. Something beneath that floor had learned how to move, and it was no longer trapped. Amos Darnell had seen death in every form, fever, famine, bullets, and winter, but nothing compared to the crawling horror beneath Widow Ashford's floor. He slammed the hatch shut, nailing it down with trembling hands, but the knocking only grew louder. The house seemed to breathe through its seams. Eleanor stood at the stove now, calm as a ghost. She stirred a pot that hadn't boiled in years. "They never complained about the stew," she said softly. "Said it was the best in the county." Amos backed away, his revolver raised. "What's in that pot, Eleanor?" She turned slowly. The ladle trembled in her hand. "You've already eaten it," she said. "Everyone has." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to collapse inward, a silence so dense it swallowed sound. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to call her mad, but the memory clawed its way up. The rich stew he'd been served years ago, in this same kitchen when his horse went lame during a rainstorm. The taste, heavy, savory, unforgettable. He felt bile rise in his throat. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You came here for justice," she said. "Then have it. Sit down, Amos." Her voice was wrong now, layered, echoing, as if something else was speaking through her. The lantern light flickered, and for an instant, her shadow stretched across the room, tall, distorted, no longer matching her frame. He fired once, warning shot. The bullet hit the stove, shattering the pot. What spilled out wasn't broth. It was bones, small ones, ribs, finger joints, scraps of cloth clinging to them. The smell that followed, thick, sickly sweet, metallic, drove him to his knees. He gagged into his sleeve. From beneath the floor came a groan, deep, resonant, human. Then another and another. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was voices, rising together in a terrible harmony, chanting something old and broken. Eleanor began to hum along. "They wanted to stay with me," she said, her face shining with sweat. "So I kept them." Amos stumbled toward the door, but the latch wouldn't move. The wood swelled, pulsing like muscle under his hand. The air was alive with whispers. Behind him, Eleanor stepped closer. "It's supper time again," she murmured. "Don't be rude." When Amos turned, she was holding the ladle like a blade. Her eyes were gone, hollow pits dripping red. Then, from beneath the floor, something laughed. And the sheriff realized the house wasn't haunted. It was feeding. The lantern light trembled across the walls as if afraid to stay. Amos snatched up his revolver, his breath ragged, the metallic stench coating his tongue. Eleanor stood. Between him and the door, her shadow dancing like a marionette on the warped boards. Outside, the wind began to howl. Not through the trees, but through the cracks of the house, like a low, human wail. He took one step forward. "Move aside, Eleanor." She didn't. Instead, she whispered, "You came too late. They're already awake." From the crawl space below came the scraping of fingernails against stone, dozens of them. A muffled chorus of moans followed, growing louder, desperate. The floor beneath his boots pulsed like it had veins. Amos fired again, not at her, but at the boards, trying to silence the noise. The blast blew splinters into the air. For a moment, everything went still. Then the house answered. A dozen hands broke through the cracks, gray, thin, twitching like insects. the air filled with the smell of rot and old firewood. Amos stumbled backward, boots slipping on blood that wasn't his. Eleanor began to sing, a soft lullaby, something children might have hummed before sleep. Her voice was calm, almost motherly, as the hands clawed their way out of the darkness. "They just want company," she said. He swung the lantern wide and hurled it toward the floor. It shattered, spilling fire across the boards. Flames caught quick, racing along the oily stains. The house roared in pain, the sound of burning, flesh and splintered memory. Eleanor shrieked, her voice splitting into two tones at once, one human, one not. "You can't burn what's already dead." Amos kicked through the doorway, splinters cutting his legs. He staggered into the cold night, coughing, eyes streaming. The house behind him glowed like a furnace, but through the fire he saw them, shapes moving in the windows, faces pressed against the glass. Some familiar, some twisted beyond recognition. Then came the laughter again, faint but unmistakable. Not from Eleanor, not from the dead. Below, but from the house itself, a deep, guttural joy. Amos fell to his knees in the mud. The ridge was silent except for the flames. He looked down at his hands and saw the blood there still, dark, fresh, and not his own. Somewhere behind him, amid the fire and smoke, Eleanor's voice drifted out one last time. "You can't kill hunger, Sheriff. You can only feed it." And the wind carried her words across the ridge, a promise that whatever was in that house would never stay buried. When dawn came, the ridge looked like the end of the world. The Ashford house was nothing but a skeleton of blackened beams, still breathing smoke into the cold Missouri air. Sheriff Amos stood among the ashes, his coat torn, eyes hollow. The fire had devoured everything, or so he hoped. But as the smoke cleared, the ground began to speak. It crackled, sighed, hissed. The embers shifted like something alive beneath them. Amos crouched low and saw what no fire should have left. Bone fragments still white as ivory, untouched by flame. They glimmered faintly in the morning light, arranged in deliberate patterns, spirals and crosses, as if the fire itself had been directed by unseen hands. He felt it again, that smell, not of smoke, not of rot, something sweeter, heavier, like cooked flesh cooling in the sun. He turned and saw her, Eleanor. She stood near the well, her dress charred to rags, skin cracked like burnt parchment, yet her eyes were clear. "You shouldn't have stayed," she said softly. Amos raised his revolver. "You're dead, Eleanor." She smiled, faint and strange. "Death doesn't mean the same thing here anymore." The ground behind her began to shift, the dirt trembling. Fingers pushed through the soil, not frantic but steady. One hand, then another, then more. The earth split open with the sound of tearing cloth. Amos stumbled back, his gun shaking. "God help us!" Eleanor tilted her head. He already tried. The first of them pulled free, faces half burned, half preserved, eyes like marbles clouded with milk. They moved without sound, without anger, only need, the kind that gnaws, the kind that remembers hunger long after death. Amos fired until the gun clicked empty. Each shot dropped one, but two more rose. They didn't bleed. They didn't even slow. He ran. Through the field, down the ridge, past the old rail line that cut through the valley. But the smell followed. Sweet, relentless. The scent of something cooked too long. When he reached the river, he fell to his knees, chest heaving. He splashed the cold water on his face and froze. His reflection blinked back at him, but his eyes were not his own. They were hers. From far behind, across the smoking ridge, came a faint sound, like the clinking of dishes, the scraping of spoons, dinner being served. Again. Amos turned toward the rising smoke and whispered, "What did you bring back, Eleanor?" And from the distance, faint but certain, came her reply, carried on the wind like a lullaby, just what was promised. The fire on Ashford Ridge burned for 3 days straight. The wind carried the smoke down into the valley, blanketing the town of Marrow Creek in a gray, choking haze. By the fourth morning, nothing remained of the widow's boarding house but cinders, half-melted iron, and the smell that refused to die, a heavy sweetness that clung to every breath. Sheriff Amos Darnell rode into town looking like he'd returned from the grave. His clothes were singed, his eyes sunken. When people asked what happened on the ridge, he said only one thing: "Don't go up there. Don't ever go up there." No one pressed him, they didn't have to. The ridge had become a wound on the land, something the town could see but wouldn't name. Children were told not to wander near it. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to go that way. And when the wind blew from the north, the church bells sometimes rang on their own. The preacher tried to sanctify what remained. He gathered a small group one night, marched up with a wooden cross, and drove it into the ashes. But by morning the cross was gone. In its place was a hole, freshly dug, as if something had clawed its way out. Within weeks, people started leaving Marrow Creek. The inn closed. The general store boarded up. The telegraph line fell silent. The town council stopped meeting altogether. But for those who stayed, strange things began. Mrs. Wainwright, the midwife, claimed she heard knocking beneath her floorboards at night. The blacksmith swore he saw Eleanor's face reflected in his forge fire. And at the old diner on Main Street, folks said that when the stew pot boiled too long, the broth turned pink, and the air filled with that same sickly sweet scent. The sheriff stopped sleeping. He sat by his window most nights, staring at the ridge. Sometimes, in the distance, he swore he could see faint orange light flickering, too steady to be lightning, too wrong to be lanterns. He tried to write a report to the state marshal, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain a hunger that doesn't burn out? By spring, Marrow Creek was half empty. The ridge was overgrown again. The birds never came back. And still, at dusk, if you stood by the well, you could hear it. That soft, wet sound of chewing coming from deep underground. They called it cursed land after that. But Amos knew better. Curses end. This was a beginning. By the summer of 1857, Marrow Creek had turned into a whisper, a half-dead town clinging to its own silence. Weeds crawled through the cracks of the main road. The old diner sign creaked in the wind, its paint stripped to bare wood. Only a handful of families remained, and each lived as though the ridge were a sleeping god they dared not wake. But hunger, in any form, never sleeps long. It began quietly. Late one evening, a traveling salesman named Jonas Merritt stopped by the sheriff's office asking for a room. The boarding houses had all closed, so Amos sent him down to the empty Miller place near the edge of town. Jonas tipped his hat, thanked him, and vanished into the dusk. By morning, there was no sign of him. His horse stood tethered outside the house. Reins snapped, eyes rolled white in terror. The front door hung open, and inside, the dust was thick, untouched. Except for one thing, a plate on the table, a half-eaten meal, stew still warm. Amos felt that old sickness crawl back up his throat. He followed the faint trail of footprints leading behind the house down to the well. The stones were slick with something dark. At the edge, he found Jonas's hat, floating in the water. Below was a ladle, the same kind Eleanor had used. That night, more travelers came. A family of 3 bound west for Kansas stopped at the creek for rest. The next day, their wagon was found turned over in the mud, their food still packed. Horses gone. Only the smell lingered, that same grotesque sweetness that made the air taste wrong. By autumn, the townsfolk whispered that the boarders had returned. But they weren't guests anymore. They were hosts. And Marrow Creek was their table. Amos began to patrol again, walking the streets with his lantern after sundown. Once, he heard voices in the distance, laughter, clinking dishes, a soft tune carried by the wind. He followed it to the ridge's base where a new cabin stood, freshly built. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was living there. Someone was feeding again. He stepped closer. Through the cracked window he saw silhouettes moving around a table, 5 of them. When one turned, Amos froze. It was Jonas Merritt, pale and smiling, ladling stew into a bowl. He looked straight toward the window and said, "You came back for supper." Amos ran, but the sound of spoons followed him all the way back to town. The new cabin wasn't on any map. Amos checked twice, comparing his old survey charts. Nothing. The ridge had been abandoned for months, the land supposedly cursed and stripped of life. Yet there it stood now, solid timber and a smoking chimney, as if it had always been there. He returned at dawn, alone, Colt holstered, Bible in his coat pocket. The grass leading up to the cabin was damp, not with dew, but something darker, thick as syrup. Flies swarmed near the porch. No footprints, no tracks. Just the faint, lingering smell, sweet, almost inviting. He knocked once. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cabin looked too clean. The floors were scrubbed white, the air still, like a church before a funeral. On the table sat 5 bowls, untouched, steaming faintly, though no fire burned. Above them, a single photograph hung crooked, Eleanor Ashford, standing beside her old house, her eyes blacked out with ash. Amos's breath caught in his chest. He lifted the lantern, casting light across the walls. That's when he saw them. Names carved into the wood, hundreds of them, each with a date, each with a number beside it. Jonas Merritt, 1857. 6. Mary Wainwright, 1857. 4. Sheriff Amos Darnell, space left blank. He stepped back, revolver raised. The floor groaned beneath him, then gave a single deliberate knock. The bowls began to tremble. Slowly, the stew inside each one began to bubble, though the pot was cold. Fat rose to the surface, then a single finger bone surfaced in each bowl, spinning lazily. "Still hungry?" The voice came from the corner, soft, female, and horribly familiar. Eleanor stepped into the lamplight. Her dress was new, clean white linen, her hair pinned like it had been before the fire. Only her hands betrayed her, burned to charcoal, still smoking faintly at the fingertips. "I told you," she said. "It doesn't stop. It only spreads." Amos pointed his gun. "You're not real." Her smile widened. "Neither are you anymore." He fired. The bullet passed through her, striking the wall behind. Splinters flew, but no blood, no fall. Instead, her shadow on the wall deepened, darkening into something that crawled. It reached for him. He fled, bursting through the door into the morning light, only to find that the ridge was gone. The valley had changed. The creek was wider, darker. The trees were blackened husks. Behind him, the cabin door closed softly, and from inside, 5 voices spoke in unison. "Sit down, Sheriff. It's been a long time since supper." Sheriff Amos Darnell didn't sleep for 3 nights after the cabin. His mind wandered like a fever dream, the edges of reality softening with every hour. The faces, the voices, the smell, they followed him, clinging to his clothes, to his skin. Even when he washed, the water ran pink. He began keeping notes, not for the marshal, not for the church, but for whoever found what was left of him. He wrote by lantern light, his words shaky, almost childlike. "If you find this, don't bury me near the ridge. Burn what's left. Don't use my name when you speak of me." By the second night, he stopped writing. The ink had turned to something darker, not quite red, not quite black. He didn't remember where it came from. He tried to pray. The words came out wrong, like his mouth had forgotten their shape. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's smile, soft, knowing, patient. "You'll understand soon," she'd said. The town had grown quieter. Windows shuttered early, no lights after dusk. The few who remained crossed the street when they saw him. They said he smelled like smoke. On the 4th day, he locked himself inside the church. The preacher was gone, or maybe he'd never been there to begin with. The pews were covered in dust, but the altar was clean, freshly wiped. Someone had carved words into the wood. "Blessed are the hungry, for they shall never die." Amos fell to his knees, clutching his head. He shouted until his voice broke. The sound echoed in ways that didn't make sense, coming back to him from the rafters, the floor, the walls. Each echo spoke with a different voice. He drew his revolver and placed it on the altar. One bullet left. He whispered, "God, if you're still up there, give me a sign." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came a faint sound, the creak of a door opening behind him. He turned slowly. In the church doorway stood 5 figures, pale, soaked, eyes gleaming like candlelight. The boarders, Jonas among them. And behind them, the faint silhouette of Eleanor, her head tilted, as if in pity. Amos raised the gun. His hand didn't shake this time. "You'll not have me," he said. Eleanor smiled. "Oh, Amos, you've already been eaten? You just haven't noticed yet." The lantern flickered out. The church filled with chewing sounds. When the sun rose over Marrow Creek that morning, there was no smoke from chimneys, no sound of roosters or wagons. The mist clung low, heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Travelers passing along the main road spoke later of how the air smelled, not of decay, but of something strangely sweet, like honey mixed with rust. Dogs refused to enter. Birds turned mid-flight. Even the river seemed to slow as it passed. The valley. The church stood with its doors open wide. Inside, the pews were overturned, the altar cracked. Sheriff Darnell's revolver lay on the floor, glistening in a pool of wax and something darker. The pulpit Bible was gone. In its place, carved deep into the wood, were 5 symbols, concentric circles surrounding a spiral that led inward, like the eye of a storm. By noon, the marshal sent 2 deputies from Springfield to investigate. They rode in with rifles drawn, shouting names into the empty streets. No response came, only the echo of their own boots. When they reached the boarding house, the front door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the air was damp and cold. Tables still set with plates, cups half full, food untouched. And yet every mirror in the place had been covered in fabric, nailed at the corners as though the house itself refused to see. One deputy, name of Caldwell, pulled down a cloth. For a second he saw nothing but his own reflection. Then, behind him, the faint shape of someone standing just out of frame. When he turned, no one was there. That was when they heard the sound. Not footsteps, not whispering. Something else, like the slow grinding of teeth on bone, coming from below. The cellar door stood at the end of the hall, partly open. A damp breeze slipped through, carrying with it a faint metallic taste. Caldwell knelt to peer inside, and froze. In the darkness beneath, dozens of faces stared back, pale, motionless, eyes wide and glassy. But they weren't bodies. They were portraits, painted directly onto the stone walls, each rendered in excruciating detail, each expression twisted between agony and awe. Caldwell's partner whispered, "What in God's name is this place?" From the shadows below came a voice. Soft, feminine, familiar. "God doesn't come here anymore." The cellar door slammed shut. The 2 deputies were never seen again. By sundown, a fog thicker than before rolled down from the ridge, covering Marrow Creek completely, and by morning the town was gone. 3 days after Marrow Creek vanished from the map, a man on horseback rode into the empty valley. His name was Elias Brand, a railway inspector and former Pinkerton agent. He had been tracing missing persons linked to the Missouri coach routes, travelers who vanished between Springfield and the Osage Crossing. Every road led to one name, the widow Margaret Boone. When Elias reached what had once been Marrow Creek, he found only silence. No birds, no livestock, just remnants, a wagon half sunk in mud, a child's shoe hanging from a fence post, a Bible scorched black as coal. He dismounted and ran his hand across the ground. The soil was warm, too warm for October. Beneath his palm, it pulsed, faintly like a dying heartbeat. Elias had seen battlefields before. He'd walked through towns ravaged by cholera and fire. But this was different. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt consumed. He entered the remnants of the boarding house. Dust lay thick on every surface. Yet the plates on the table were spotless, as though someone had just cleared them moments before. A pot still hung over the cold hearth, filled halfway with a thick, tar-like residue that reeked faintly of iron. Elias set down his canteen, trying not to breathe too deeply. That's when he saw the book. It rested on a small table beside the hearth, leather-bound, initials embossed in gold, M.B. He opened it carefully. The pages were smeared with grease and fingerprints, written in looping cursive that seemed to waver the longer he stared. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. Each page listed names, dates of arrival, durations of stay, and beside many, a small hand-drawn mark, a circle crossed with a single line. At the bottom of the final page, the handwriting changed. Rougher, desperate. They came for her in the night, but she was already inside them. Elias looked up sharply. A draft blew through the open window, stirring the curtains. He thought he saw a figure move past the doorway, a woman in black, her gait slow, deliberate, as if wading through deep water. He called out, "Ma'am?" No answer, only the faint rattle of pans in the kitchen. He followed the sound, step by step, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. And there, at the far end of the kitchen, the cellar door stood closed. The wood around its hinges was fresh, as if it had been replaced recently. He placed his ear against it. From below came a whisper, barely audible, yet distinct enough to freeze his blood. "Hungry?" Elias stepped back, drew his revolver, and aimed for the latch. But before he could fire, a knock came from behind him, slow, patient. Someone knocking on the front door. Elias froze. The sound was unmistakable, 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoing through the hollow boarding house. He turned toward the front door, his revolver raised, every nerve taut. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the knocking came again, softer this time, almost polite. He stepped forward cautiously, boots creaking against the warped floorboards. A breeze whispered through the broken windows, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt sugar and something metallic. As he neared the door, he noticed the latch trembling slightly, not from wind but from something on the other side pressing gently against it. "Who's there?" Elias called out, his voice steady though his hands were not. A pause. Then, a voice, faint, fragile, and unmistakably female. "I've been waiting for you, Mr. Brand." Elias stiffened. No one should have known his name. He tightened his grip on the revolver, nudged the door open with the barrel, and looked out. Into the fading light. A woman stood there, cloaked in black, her veil drawn low. The evening sun glinted off something silver in her hand, a locket swinging gently from her fingers. Her face was hidden, but her voice carried that strange blend of grief and command. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "This ground remembers." Elias studied her carefully. "You from around here, ma'am?" She tilted her head, almost in pity. "Was," she replied, "before the earth took us." For the first time he saw what she meant. Her boots didn't sink into the soil. They hovered just above it, like a mirage trembling in heat. Elias blinked, and the figure flickered. One moment near, the next 10 feet away. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath visible in the dusk. The air tasted of iron again. The woman lifted her veil. Beneath it, her face was pale as candle wax, her eyes sunken but aware, not lifeless, not quite human either. "Margaret Boone," Elias whispered. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Names are only useful while you're alive," she said softly. "You came looking for truth, Mr. Brand, but truth's been feeding here longer than I ever did." A sound rose from behind her, low, guttural, like dozens of voices murmuring beneath the ground. Elias stepped back instinctively. Revolver aimed, but she raised a hand. "If you open the cellar," she whispered, "you'll understand. But you won't come back up." And with that, she turned and walked toward the edge of the property, fading into the twilight as if she were made of smoke. Elias stood, motionless, the only sound his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, from deep inside the house, the cellar door creaked open on its own. A breath escaped into the night. Something was coming up. The cellar door yawned open, its hinges shrieking like an animal in pain. Elias turned sharply, revolver raised, as the stench of rot and damp flesh rolled through the house. It was heavier now, not just a smell, but a presence, as though the air itself recoiled from what it carried. He stepped toward the cellar entrance, the floorboards groaning beneath him. His boots touched the edge, and for a moment, the air went still, utterly still. Then a sound emerged from below. Wet, dragging, slow. Elias steadied his breath. "Show yourself," he said quietly. His voice trembled, and the sound of it seemed to echo too long in that empty house. From the darkness below came a shape, first a hand, pale and swollen, gripping the stair rail. Then another. The figure that climbed into view wore what might once have been a dress, though it hung in tatters now, soaked through with something dark. The skin was gray, pocked with lesions, yet the eyes were human, and they knew him. "Elias," it rasped, the sound scraping through its throat like a blade dragged across stone. He staggered back, revolver raised, unable to speak. "You took my son," it whispered. "Left him on the road. You left us all." It took him several seconds to recognize the face beneath the decay. Annie Collier, a woman he'd once interviewed after her husband vanished near Springfield. She'd disappeared soon after. But here she was, or what was left of her, crawling from the cellar of the Widow Boone. "What happened to you?" Elias demanded. Her head tilted unnaturally, bones creaking. "We stayed," she said. "She fed us, and when there was nothing left, we fed her." More shapes began to stir behind her in the stairwell, silhouettes moving, murmuring, their mouths opening in perfect unison. "Join us." The cellar erupted in sound, a chorus of hunger and pain, dozens of voices layered on top of one another, crying, laughing, choking. The walls trembled. Elias fired twice into the darkness, muzzle flashes lighting the stairwell. But the figures kept coming, arms reaching, eyes gleaming like glass in lamplight. He stumbled back toward the door, slamming it shut with all his strength and dragging a table across it. The wood shuddered with impact as something pounded from the other side. Rhythmic, unstoppable. Elias turned, breath ragged, and saw movement near the hearth. The ledger was open again, though he hadn't touched it. New words had appeared in fresh ink, still wet and glistening under the fading light. Once fed, always returned. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then, a whisper from just behind his ear. "Your turn." Elias spun around, revolver raised, but no one stood behind him. Only the whisper of cold air brushing his neck, and the faintest echo of laughter retreating into the walls. The house felt alive now, breathing, watching. Its silence had weight, like a predator waiting for the next heartbeat. He backed toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The knob was red hot to the touch, the metal burning his palm. He yanked his hand away, the smell of scorched skin filling the air. Somewhere below, the cellar began to pulse with a dull, rhythmic thud, like the beating of a buried heart. The ledger on the table snapped shut on its own. The pages inside flared red, then blackened to ash. Elias stumbled back as a thin wisp of smoke rose from the binding. Not ordinary smoke, but something oily, almost liquid, that spread across the ceiling like tendrils. And then the sound came. A low, bubbling hiss, as though the ground itself were boiling beneath the floorboards. The boards began to darken, heat seeping upward. He dropped to his knees and pressed a hand to the ground. It was hot, too hot. He ran toward the window, smashing the glass with the butt of his revolver. But instead of open air, there was brick, solid, seamless brick where open fields should have been. The entire house was sealing itself shut. That's when he heard the voice again, soft, calm, and unmistakable. "It began with warmth," said Margaret Boone, "and it ends the same." She was standing at the top of the cellar stairs, veil gone now, her face illuminated by a sickly orange glow from below. Flames flickered behind her, but they didn't burn her dress. They clung to her, wrapping around her like ribbons of molten silk. Elias aimed his revolver, his voice cracking. "You did this. You killed them all." Margaret smiled faintly. "No, I only gave them what they asked for, shelter, warmth, and food when there was none. The earth took the rest." The floor buckled, a crack splitting the room in half. Heat burst upward, blinding, and from within the fissure came a roar, not of flame, but of something deeper, older. Elias staggered, covering his face as the boards splintered. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes hollow, her voice almost tender. "Every home feeds on something, Elias. This one just learned to feed back." The crack widened, and beneath it, not fire, but movement, writhing, glistening, alive. He fired at her. Once, twice. The bullets passed through her, hissing in the heat. She didn't flinch. "You can't kill hunger," she whispered. The floor collapsed, and Elias fell into the fire that wasn't fire, into the red, beating heart of the house itself. When Elias hit the bottom, he expected flame, searing pain, suffocation. But there was no fire, only heat, a pulsing, living heat that pressed against his skin like breath. He looked around and realized he was no longer in a cellar at all. The walls were no longer wooden or stone, they were flesh, veined, damp, twitching. The boards above were gone, replaced by a ceiling that expanded and contracted with each slow, thunderous beat. He was inside the house, not beneath it, not around it. Inside it, like a swallowed insect. The air shimmered crimson. A viscous substance dripped from the walls, thick as blood, pooling around his boots. Every few seconds, the ground trembled with a pulse that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. Elias tried to steady his breath, to focus on the faint glimmer ahead. Light, distant but real. He trudged toward it, revolver still in hand, though he knew it meant nothing here. His footsteps squelched in the slick ground, each step echoing like a whisper through bone. As he walked, he saw things embedded in the walls. Faces. Dozens of them. Men, women, even children. Some screaming, some silent, some weeping soundlessly as their eyes followed him. One face, pale and small, caught his attention. A boy with a missing front tooth, his expression calm despite his entrapment. Elias knelt closer, recognizing him instantly. The missing son of Annie Collier. The boy's lips parted slightly. "She's still feeding," he whispered. Elias jerked back. "Where is she?" The boy's gaze shifted upward. Elias followed it. And there above him, half absorbed into the pulsing wall, hung Margaret Boone. Her body was fused with the house itself, her veins glowing faintly with the same light that filled the chamber. Her eyes opened slowly as he stared. "You came so far," she said, voice thick with resonance. "Do you understand now? The house isn't cursed. It's alive. We built it with grief, fed it with sin. You all did." She lifted a trembling arm. The flesh around her rippled, and the faces in the wall began to moan. Elias backed away, but the floor itself rose to meet him, clutching at his boots like hands. He fired, once, twice, into the mass above her. The shots echoed like thunder, and the walls screamed, literally screamed, a sound of agony and hunger collapsing into chaos. The light flared red, then white. The ground lurched violently. Elias covered his face as the chamber began to collapse inward, walls melting, faces dissolving into the red flood. Margaret's voice was the last thing he heard before the world turned black. "You can't kill what's already eaten you." When Elias opened his eyes, the world was gray. The red glow was gone, the pulsing silence replaced by the faint crackle of something burning far away. He lay on the ground, cold, wet earth beneath him, staring up at a sky heavy with smoke. The boarding house was gone. Nothing remained but a blackened crater and the twisted skeletons of its foundation beams jutting from the soil like ribs. The air reeked of ash and iron. A faint drizzle fell, but it didn't cleanse the air. It only carried the stench deeper into his lungs. He tried to stand. His hands shook. His revolver was gone, his boots half buried in mud. He touched his temple. It came away streaked with soot and something darker. For a long time he said nothing, just listened. No birds, no wind, no life. And then faintly the sound of breathing. Not his own. He turned. Near the crater's edge lay a figure. A woman curled on her side, her dress torn, her hair singed. Margaret Boone, alive, barely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, eyes fluttering beneath soot-streaked lids. Elias approached cautiously. "It's over," he said. "It's finished." Her lips twitched, something between a smile and a grimace. "Over?" she whispered. "You think hunger burns?" He knelt beside her. The ground beneath her shimmered faintly, and he realized with a chill that it wasn't soil at all. It was ash mixed with bone. Thousands of fragments, white and brittle, spreading outward like snow. "You don't get it, do you?" she rasped. "We fed this place for years, every sorrow, every secret. You think it stops when the fire goes out?" He looked down at his hands. The skin blistered, burned, but beneath the black soot, it was pulsing, faintly. His veins glowed with that same dim red light he'd seen in the heart of the house. "No," he whispered. "No, it can't." Margaret's hand shot up, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes opened. Not human anymore, but dull and glassy like cooling embers. "You breathed it in," she said softly. "It's in you now. It always needs a home." He tore free and stumbled backward, heart pounding. But as he turned away, he noticed the earth shifting where she lay. Her body was sinking, not burning, not decomposing, but absorbing into the ash, as though the ground itself were reclaiming her. She didn't scream. She only smiled as she vanished. The last thing Elias heard was her whisper carried through the wind. "Welcome home, Mr. Brand." The crater pulsed once, faint like a heartbeat, then went still. And far off in the distance, in the ruins of Marrow Creek, a single lamp flickered back to life. Morning came to Marrow Creek like a lie. Sunlight that felt borrowed, thin, as though it didn't truly belong there anymore. Elias stood on what used to be the main street, surrounded by the faint outlines of houses now reduced to mounds of ash. Yet, somehow, the town still stood in memory. The roads were there, the fences, even the smell of bread and smoke. He could feel it, the echo of what was. He wasn't alone. At first he thought the shapes moving at the far end of the road were smoke columns. But they walked, slowly, uncertainly, as if relearning the act. Dozens of figures emerged from the haze, faces gray, eyes dim but open. They didn't speak. They simply existed, drifting through the ruins like moths that had forgotten fire. Elias called out, "Who's there?" No answer, only the sound of their feet dragging across gravel. He recognized one face, then another. Annie Collier, her husband, the boy with the missing tooth, even the old preacher from the southern road, all dead, all here. Margaret's words came back to him. "You breathed it in." He pressed his hand against his chest. The faint glow beneath his skin pulsed once more. Not a wound now, but a rhythm. Something inside him was alive. And it wasn't his heart. The nearest figure stopped in front of him. A man with half a face, burnt clean through on one side, but his eyes still glimmered faintly. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he murmured. Elias stumbled back, shaking his head. "I didn't open it. She did." The man tilted his head. "We're all she now." Behind him the others began to hum, a low, resonant tone that rolled across the ash like thunder. The ground responded. Tiny fissures split open, glowing red for a heartbeat before sealing again. The pulse beneath the earth was returning, stronger this time, steady as breath. Elias turned to run, but every direction looked the same. The horizon folded in on itself, a circle of gray, infinite and suffocating. The air grew thicker, the smell of iron returning, sweet and nauseating. He fell to his knees, clutching the ground, and felt it move beneath his fingers. Warm, wet, breathing. The figures surrounded him, faces blank, humming in unison. The sound grew louder until it wasn't a hum anymore, but words, hundreds of them whispering the same sentence over and over. We feed. We feed. We feed. Elias screamed, but the wind swallowed it whole. Somewhere beneath him, the red heart of the house began to beat again. And this time, it had found its new host. The first sign of her return was the smell, not of death, but of cooked meat. Sweet, heavy, and unmistakable. It drifted through the ruins at dawn, curling between the skeletal remains of homes, settling thick over the crater where the boarding house once stood. Elias woke to it choking his throat, and for a moment he thought he was back inside the house again. But the world was different now. The air shimmered, as though the morning sun couldn't decide whether to rise or burn everything flat. The Sia, townspeople, or what was left of them, stood motionless, staring at the pit. None spoke, none blinked. Then the ground shivered. From the center of the crater rose a single blackened beam, wet and glistening like bone drawn from flesh. Beneath it, the soil shifted, expanding, cracking. The ash fell away like silk until a shape began to emerge. The outline of a woman, rising inch by inch, her dress fused with the earth, her hair clotted with soot and blood. Margaret Boone had come back. Elias staggered backward, his breath catching. He'd seen her burn, he'd watched the earth take her. But now she stood taller, her skin marked with fissures of faint red light, her eyes hollow yet aware. The townspeople turned toward her in perfect unison, like puppets sensing the hand that controls them. "You see?" she whispered, her voice carrying effortlessly through the smoke. "Fire doesn't cleanse, it remembers." She stepped forward, her bare feet leaving prints that smoked in the dirt. Each footprint pulsed briefly before fading, as though the ground drank them in. Elias drew his knife. The revolver was useless now, and faced her. "You can't stay here. You can't be here." Margaret smiled faintly, almost kindly. "Oh, Elias," she said. "You still think you're outside the house?" She raised her hand, and the town responded. The dead moved. Their bodies straightened, their faces smoothed into calm, unfeeling masks. Some began to whisper his name, others simply waited. The hum began again, that same low, inhuman resonance that had shaken the cellar. "You carried me out," she said softly. "When you breathed the ash, when you left with my hunger inside you." Elias dropped the knife, horror dawning. The glow beneath his skin brightened, veins turning red, burning hot. "No," he gasped. "No, I won't." She reached out a hand toward him, and every corpse mirrored her gesture. "Feed," she whispered. The ground cracked open like a wound. The heartbeat returned. The whole town trembled. And somewhere deep beneath the ruins, something vast and unseen began to wake. The sky over Marrow Creek turned red by noon, not with sunlight, but with the reflection of something burning beneath the earth. The ground pulsed like muscle, each heartbeat sending ripples through the soil. The air was hot, alive, and thick with the smell of roasted flesh. Elias stumbled through the ruins, clutching his chest, the red glow beneath his skin spreading like infection. Every pulse from the ground matched his own. The connection between him and the house, no, between him and her, was tightening. The townspeople followed silently. They didn't walk so much as drift, their movements slow but inevitable, faces blank, eyes empty. Their mouths opened and closed in rhythm, whispering the same word over and over. Feed, feed, feed. At the crater's center, Margaret Boone stood like a black pillar against the crimson light. Her hair blew in the heat like strands of coal smoke. Her voice was calm, even tender, the voice of a mother calling her children to supper. "You were all so hungry," she said. "Hungry for love, for safety, for forgiveness. You came to me for shelter, and I gave it. But you never stopped wanting. So now, you'll feed forever." The dead obeyed. They began to kneel, hands outstretched toward the crater as the ground opened wider. From beneath came the sound of bones grinding, of tendons stretching. A pit revealed itself, but it wasn't empty. It was alive. Red tendrils coiled up from below, slick and pulsating, wrapping around the kneeling figures. They didn't fight. They smiled as the tendrils pierced their skin, drawing them down one by one into the molten soil. Elias screamed, running toward Margaret, knife raised high. "You're killing them!" She turned to him slowly, her eyes bright with unnatural light. "No," she whispered. "I'm feeding them." He slashed at her, the blade passing through her form as though cutting smoke. The force of the swing threw him forward, down to the edge of the pit. He looked inside, and what he saw froze his breath. The red mass wasn't earth, it was a body, the size of the town itself. Every building, every road, every grave had been absorbed into one monstrous form, a heart of flesh built from the dead and still beating. The faces of the townspeople rippled across its surface, smiling through the agony. Margaret reached out and placed her hand over Elias's chest. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. "That's not your pulse, Elias. That's ours." The ground erupted. Red light poured upward, swallowing sky and sound alike. And in that moment, Elias realized the terrible truth. Marrow Creek hadn't died. It was eating. When the first church bell rang, it wasn't from human hands. The bell tower, half buried and cracked, moved on its own, groaning as the metal clapper swung inside. The sound was distorted, dragging through the air like the scream of iron against bone. Every echo awakened something beneath the town. Marrow Creek trembled as the streets split apart. Caskets burst from their graves. Houses folded inward as if swallowed by invisible jaws. From the cracks came not lava, not fire, but voices. They rose like smoke, overlapping, whispering in hundreds of tones. Men, women, children, all repeating one phrase, perfectly in sync. "We are still here." Elias stumbled across the shattered road, his skin glowing faintly in the dark. He clutched the knife, now dull and blackened by the heat, and looked toward what had once been Boone Manor. The structure had collapsed into itself, forming a spiral pit that pulsed like a heartbeat. From that pit rose Margaret Boone, no longer human, no longer spirit. Her form flickered, stitched together from shadow and fire. The red veins of the earth threaded through her body like roots. She was the town now. "Do you understand it yet?" Her voice filled the night, neither kind nor cruel, just inevitable. There was never a curse, there was only hunger. The kind that keeps creation alive. Elias fell to his knees as the sky cracked open. Through the fissure, he saw not stars but faces, countless faces, staring back from the black void above. They were the same people who had once lived here, now part of something ancient, something vast. The ground beneath him began to split further, forming a circle around his body. He felt his veins pull toward the soil, his blood drawn downward, like water through roots. His mind flickered with images. Margaret in 1834, kneeling in her garden. The orphans chained in the basement. The doctor cutting flesh from his own arm to feed the soil. It was all one ritual, replaying through centuries. The sky howled. The bell rang again, once, twice, thrice, and with each toll, the world seemed to fold tighter around Marrow Creek. The town was being sealed, cocooned in darkness. Elias looked up one last time, his eyes wide with the terror of understanding. "Margaret," he whispered, "you've made us part of it." She smiled faintly. "You always were." And as the final bell rang, the earth swallowed the town whole. No sound remained, no light, only the pulse, faint, steady, eternal, beating somewhere far beneath the ground. When dawn finally came, it brought no light. The horizon remained gray and bloodless, the sky sealed under a permanent shroud. What had once been Marrow Creek was now nothing more than a scar upon the earth, a wide, silent depression where birds refused to fly and no wind dared to pass. Travelers who came through Missouri years later would whisper of a hollow in the hills where compasses spun and sound itself seemed to fade. Horses balked at its edge. Dogs whined, sensing something beneath the ground, something still breathing. No one spoke the town's name anymore. Not aloud. And yet, some nights, when the air hung still, faint echoes could be heard. The toll of a bell, the soft rhythmic beat of something vast and slow, the pulse of the buried. In the county archives, the official record of Marrow Creek ends abruptly in 1856. The final entry, the widow Margaret Boone, declared missing, presumed dead, but the archivist who wrote it made a note in the margin, a small, almost apologetic sentence written in faded ink. The ground still moves. Decades later, a mining company purchased the land for its rich soil and hidden veins of iron. The first day the drills touched the earth, they struck something soft, like flesh beneath stone. Workers swore they heard the ground groan as if exhaling. Within hours, every piece of equipment failed. One by one, the miners left, muttering that the place was alive. No one returned. A century passed. The world forgot Margaret Boone. Her boarding house, her boarders, the taste of her stew. But the earth remembered. It remembered the warmth of blood, the sound of fear, the way hunger could bind souls tighter than love ever could. And then, one spring, a farmer digging a well on the outer ridge unearthed a small porcelain teacup. Its rim was smooth, hand-painted, with a faded floral pattern. Inside it, perfectly preserved, was a single human tooth. When the farmer lifted it, the wind changed. The air grew thick. Somewhere deep underground, miles beneath his feet, something stirred, slow and deliberate. A whisper rose from the soil, barely audible, spoken in a voice that hadn't been heard in 100 years. "Dinner is served." He dropped the cup. It shattered. The wind stopped. The ground grew still again. But those who live nearby still say that on the anniversary of that night in 1856, if you press your ear to the soil, you can hear her hum, a faint tuneless lullaby, and beneath it the sound of chewing,